Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. No, it's not me. It's us.
Take two.
Take two. Thank you for joining us today on the latest episode of Rod and Ring Ancient Near East meets Modern West. I am Samuel David.
And I am the co-host, Jake Baxter.
And today we're going to talk about the cosmological tale that is the Enuma Elish, also known as the Babylonian Creation Epic. With regards to the actual words that are used as the title of the myth, Enuma Elish, what we're actually looking at is the incipit, or the first few words of the actual tablets upon which the story is composed. So the actual words Enuma Elish mean when on high, or in this case, with the most recent translation that just came out behind me, when heaven on high. And it goes on to state when heaven on high had not been named and the ground below was not given a name, primordial Apsu, who fathered them, and the creative force Tiamat, who gave birth to them all, were mingling together in their waters. Now, who are these two figures? I know many in the occult community or the esoteric community as a whole, whether that would be Wiccans or traditional witches, what have you, polytheists. We know who Tiamat is, and if anyone has seen the previous episode to this one where I discussed the figure of Tiamat in the occult with my guest Psycho Sorcerer and Solomon Pakal, we went into, I don't want to say in-depth detail about Tiamat, but we did touch on her various points and her relevance in the esoteric community. However, we're looking at the figure through the lens of a Babylonian ethos as a goddess, as a monster, and as an antagonist.
Embodiment of chaos.
You being the linguistics expert, whereas I am more of the liturgical and lore expert, if you will. What are your thoughts on the subject as a whole?
So I think from a linguistic point of view, or even just a kind of as you say, participant point of view, I think the Enuma Elish kind of, it's really interesting. It's basically an amalgamation of earlier myths. So you've got like the kind of thing that you mentioned earlier with the first words being Enuma Elish, which of course essentially becomes the naming of it. That's again a trope that we see in the early Mesopotamian, Sumerian compositions, or even just earlier things such as, Gilgamesh, for example, he who saw the deep, or the abyss, or he who saw the abyss, that kind of thing. That essentially became the name of that tablet and that kind of thing. So you start to see carry over, you start to see like a final form of myths from earlier kind of tales come together in the Enuma Elish. And again, essentially it's a veneration, isn't it? It's a story that's created around other kind of existing tropes of Mesopotamian myth, essentially to create this character and venerate this character of Marduk.
What we also have as an interesting parallel is the fact that this particular myth does have its predecessors in the form of other conflict myths in terms of not so much the creation of the world or the cosmos or what have you, but in the creation and maintenance of civilized society or agricultural societies. For instance, one of the myths that come to mind is an Akkadian narrative in which the elder generation of gods led by Enlil is afraid of the rising power and influence of the lesser generation of gods, if you will, who rally together and rise up against their oppressors. So we have the first tablet, which goes into detail about the eldest generation of gods that were conceived by the Babylonians, and it begins with Apsu and Tiamat, and from their coupling We have another pair of gods, Lamu and Lahamu. From them we have Anshar and Kishar, who were the totality of heaven and the totality of earth. And then finally we come to the generations that are comprised of the gods that many of us know today. Anu, who is also known as An to the Sumerians, and he is the de facto god father and progenitor of the latest incarnation of gods. He is the personification of heaven. His ideogram, or the rendering of his name, is actually the same sign used for heaven, but it's duplicated to indicate not just heaven as a concept, but also heaven as a divine aspect. It's the determinative, the dingir symbol that's used to establish as to whether or not the subject in question is a deity or a divine concept or any number of numinous power or origin.
Yeah, and we start to see a kind of filling in of the gaps, if you like, with some of the early Sumerian compositions. We don't really know who's father and things like that. You know, there's like as the time goes on, we start to see introductions and things like that. But here we're actually getting from the very beginning. You know, we get this god, and then we get this god, who's this person's father, by the way. You know, it's building a full picture. It's filling in some of the gaps from the earlier periods, I think, as well.
It's almost like reading the Bible. For those that are familiar with the Genesis narratives that detail the descendants of Adam, which are also quite interesting parallels to the Sumerian king list.
You know, like reigning for 3,600 years and things like that. See that parallel. But I just wanted to touch on the names that we see here as well. So we see, as you've just mentioned, you know, we got Anshar and Kishar. So their names in the Akkadian transcription, which very nicely is on the opposite page of the English transcription, which was a very good decision for this book, might I say, is actually, it seems to me anyway, to be in Sumerian, as I mentioned earlier. So An, as you said, is Sumerian for An, and Shah literally means totality, or 3,600 if it's transcribed as a number, but no, it can mean totality. So as you said, totality of heaven, totality of earth, but that seems to be written in Sumerian. So again, a nod to the predecessors, which I think is absolutely fantastic. But they also slide in a lot of epithets, right? So we've got on line 16 of tablet 1, where it says, and Anu gave birth to his likeness in turn, Nudimud, which obviously is a kind of learned name for Enki. The etymology is quite interesting because in the center, the word dim can mean creation, and mud can also mean creation. So I have heard in the community people mention that his name is basically that of the one who creates, which would line up with his role within myths and stories, that the gods that Tiamat and Apsu have begotten are living in Tiamat's belly, quite literally living within the waters in her stomach, and essentially they are clamoring, they are causing noise, and Apsu is pretty annoyed by that.
He wants his wife to have a quiet pregnancy.
But we see the parallel, don't we, in the Atrahasis myth?
Yes.
As you mentioned, we see Enlil gets, you know, miffed at the noise, the clamoring of the gods that he, you know, that they created, and as a result, wants to terminate them all. So we're seeing the same parallel here in this myth, but we're seeing it within the role of Apsu instead. I think what's interesting as well to mention is, of course, Tiamat seems to be kind of taking over the role of Nama or Namu from earlier Sumerian creation
Hmm.
myths, who is Enki's mother, if I remember correctly, and is essentially her name, the cuneiform symbol or sign used to write her name is, I believe, Ngor, which apparently is synonymous with the Apsu, the cosmic underground water.
Right.
So here we have a separation, don't we? We have Apsu as a deity, as a like a deified version, rather than it just being a kind of place. It's now a deity, which again is not, it's not something completely new as a concept, but I think it's interesting, as I say, with this particular piece with the Enuma Elish, as it kind of starts to blend in earlier myths and earlier tropes and form it into this new narrative, which I wonder how would have been received at the time when it was written, which again is actually up for debate when it was written. But I would be interested to see how it was received, because it's, I would imagine, quite heretical in some places, like heresy. I don't
Yeah,
know.
most definitely. And let's face it, at the end of the day, the text was written as religious propaganda.
To circle back to where we were in the story, so to sum up, we have Tiamat and Apsu and Momu, who have essentially collaborated and created the gods. That's essentially where we are, and the gods that are now living in Tiamat's belly are causing a ruckus, as we see in earlier myths, and Apsu is holding council with Tiamat and Momu to say, let's get rid. That's where we are in Tablet 1. That's where we're up to. And I think this is where it gets interesting, is we have a kind of, this is a bit of a stretch, I admit, but I think we start to see a little bit of a kind of devil on the shoulder kind of character,
Yeah, definitely.
Mumu, right? Because essentially Apsu is saying, um, to quote, their ways disturb me. By day I have no rest, by night no sleep. I will destroy their ways, disrupt them. So Tiamat kicks off, should we say? She kicks off. Um, but
My babies.
but Mumu it slides in and takes counsel, which means, gossips and tries to cause a bit of havoc
He's
with.
like the court eunuch who's like
Yeah,
whispering in the ear of the king. What's interesting is how he is described as sitting in the lap of Apsu and kissing him. Not and kissing him is in this context not in a romantic erotic manner, but I think it is essentially a motif that allows the reader or the listener to know, oh, he is really laying it on thick.
do you know what? The way you've just explained that, then it kind of reminds me of Macbeth. Is it Lady Macbeth when she's convincing Macbeth to kill Duncan? And she's being, all swoony, like, oh, think of all the things that we'll get if you do this.
Yes.
And that's exactly what we're seeing. It's not. It almost is seductive, but not in a sexual way, like you say, more of a coercive way. But it works anyway. Momu seems to have got the job done. And essentially, it seems that the gods, according the way it's written, it would make you think that the gods heard. It quite literally says the gods listened and panicked. So they heard over. They must have overheard this deliberation. Which causes more of a ruckus, I imagine. But this is where we start to see Enki or Ea or Yah. We start to see the introduction of Enki now, which do you know what? At least they didn't change Enki too much, and he's the smart one. And this is where we see the termination of Apsu. Okay, this is it. This is where we first see the first death.
This is where Apsu goes from a god and a personification of the water to, well, being the home in which Enki or Yah has or rather being the substance in which Enki has made his dwelling. So
Yeah.
his corpse, if you will, is the primordial container of the waters of the abyss, or the waters of knowledge that are possessed by Enki or Yah.
Um, what the language is really interesting here. So we see Enki apparently pours sleep over Apsu with a spell, um, which conjures up some quite interesting imagery, if I do say so. Um, and the counselor Mummu was put into a waking stupor. So, how do you think that? What comes into your mind when you hear that?
It almost sounds like he is so horrified of what he's just witnessed. And then it goes on to state he untied his sash, stripped off his crown, and took away his frightful aura and put it on himself. So not only do we have Apsu being put to sleep by magical means, we have his unfortunate vizier or advisor being put into this state of shock, and it's of course accompanied with his symbols of authority, his sash, his crown, his aura, or his malam being stripped of him. And we go on to see that Enki or Yah puts it upon himself. He is stripping the power of another deity.
He's usurping the
He's
throne,
usurping the throne and taking what he believes is rightfully his.
which again
There's a
is
lot
very
of patricide going on here.
well. I mean, that that happened a lot. But what we're seeing as well is again we're seeing the ties to older myths. So, for
Yes.
example, so that this for me is reminiscent of Inanna and her descent to the core or the
Mhm.
Urkala. We see her stripping of regalia, don't we? We see her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace coming off with each. She basically becomes stripped of her power, and these things, the sash, the crown, are embodiments of that, or they are kind of materialistic embodiments of
Right.
those. So we're seeing that same, we're seeing the same language being used, or the same kind of trope used in here as well, which if I was reading it at the time, I'd be like, oh, yeah, I've heard that before. Um, so we have Enki seizing power, essentially, taking the regalia, the royal regalia, and thrusting it upon himself, and essentially creating the Apsu. Um, it says, Ea rested calmly within his chamber and called it Apsu, that makes known the shrines. There he founded his sanctuary. Now we're starting to get even in the language, even before Marduk has been, you know, put into the womb of Dan Keener here, he is referred to as the sage of the gods. The Lord was conceived. Within the Apsu, Marduk was created. Within the sacred Apsu, Marduk was created. So he's already a sage, and he's not even been born yet, apparently.
It's funny. This reminds me of the biblical passage. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So it's like he is immanent and transcendent. Marduk is immanent and transcendent of the Apsu itself.
He's been created, and he was grown manly. Oh, sorry, his growth was manly. He was mighty from the start. So already we're seeing how he was destined to be great, essentially.
Hmm.
Um, Anu, who created his father, exalted. He exalted, lighting up his heart full of joy. He perfected him so that his divinity became different. He is truly eminent, supreme among them in every way. So we see these kind of tropes, don't we, throughout all the other myths. This god is better than all the rest, or who else is like Ninurta? Who else could be like? We see these kind of venerations, and I think it's really nice linguistically. Um, but yeah, that's where we are. So they're basically venerating Marduk and how great he is, and how tall he's going to be, and how perfect he's going to look. He stands tall among the gods, supreme in form. His limbs are enormous, supreme from birth. Lucky him. But it's very close to Gilgamesh and his description of his form, how perfect he is. He's tall, he's muscular. It's very symbol. I think it's very similar. I think
Yeah. Standing ahead above the rest, he's better than the best.
that's it. Exactly that. And one thing I wanted to mention here is exactly what we've just mentioned. We spoke about the Melamu. Marduk wasn't just, dressed in Melam. He was dressed in the frightful aura of 10 gods. That's like the English equivalent of saying he was as strong as 10 men. Enveloped up high and 50 dreads were heaped upon him. When it says dreads, what do we think that means? Because I'm not too sure.
So I'm thinking that with regards to these 50 dreads, I mean, later we have the association with the 50 names. I think that this is just par for the course. He possesses the power and majesty of 10 gods. He's 50 times better than the rest. But then we have something that's quite fascinating, and I find this is an interesting facet of deities that have associations specifically with Enki and the multiple faces or the multiple attributes to their face. So we have and this is the only time that a deity is described in this manner. We have Marduk, who is described as possessing 4 eyes and 4 ears, which is a nod to his ability to see in all directions, hear everything, and there is an idol or an effigy of a deity. It depicts a deity that has a face that faces forward, one faces to the left, one faces to the right, and the other faces behind him. And in one of the many texts that I found, or many books that I found that expound upon Marduk, that particular illustration is used, or that particular image is used to illustrate Marduk. What's interesting is Enki's minister or vizier, Isimud, has 2 faces. So there's something there that I think, and of course, me being my tangential self, getting off topic.
I think it kind of cements what you mentioned earlier, which was he's 50 times better. Isimud has 2 faces, Marduk has 4. Kind of trope, like this. He's double of what from the beginning we're seeing this character being built better than the rest of them. Like you said, he's got more of everything else. He's bigger, he's stronger, he can see everything, he can hear everything. We're seeing him becoming God, as in singular, the God. That's what I think we're seeing. I think we're seeing the birth of almost the birth of monotheism. That's probably a large statement, but you get what I'm saying. Like we're starting to see that kind of. There is other gods, but not anyone better than this one.
Yeah, so we're looking essentially at henotheism then, where we're going to venerate one specific deity. We're not going to ignore the fact that other deities exist. We're just going to focus on this one.
To add to your point there about Isimud and Enki's connection, I think that's what we're seeing. Anyone that's associated with Enki is essentially one of wisdom, right? Even like Adapa, the sage. He's a sage. He's smarter than everybody else, that kind of thing. So it's like you've seen, what's his name? Utnapishtim, Atrahasis,
yes,
the priest or king, whatever version you want to read, of Enki. Whoever's associated with him is tied so deeply to knowledge and of a kind of deeper understanding of everything.
Divine knowledge, divine word, divine comprehension of the world at large.
Galzu, as the Sumerians would say, the great knowledge. So yeah, I completely second that. I think that's a really interesting connection. So to move through the rest of this, to sum up where we are, so Marduk's been created. He's bigger and better than everybody else, of course. He's the best god. Now, Anu has created basically a weapon from how we see later on. Has created the four winds, giving birth to them and handing them to him being Marduk, and he says, "Let my son play."
I do want to touch on the four winds within the Mesopotamian ethos, in the sense that we have each wind associated with a specific power. More commonly, the south wind is a wind of ill omen. It's the wind that's associated with Pazuzu. It's the wind that overturned Dadapa's boat. So by creating the four winds, giving them to Marduk, Marduk is essentially the bearer of this force that controls the compass points. It controls the powers of favor, the powers of famine. It's like he is, in this instance, being given control over the four corners of the earth.
We see that in basically every Sumerian foundation tablets. Anubda, which is the corners, and then Limu, I think. Limu, Anubda, the four corners, essentially, or the four quarters, technically, which is essentially, isn't it, saying king of the world. Like we hear Irving Finkel talk about the Babylonian map of the world. Babylon is essentially the center of the world,
Right.
isn't it?
Right.
They are. So having Marduk or anyone who takes the title is essentially the king of everything, aren't they? They hold all the power. And in Sumer, they would say king of Sumer and Akkad, basically.
Yes.
King of the north, king of the south, seeing it fit into the politics of the time. You know, like you're seeing it. It's the same language. You know, even the gods themselves are taking on the same things that the kings would do. You know, with the crown, the regalia. Again, we're seeing these direct connections with kings and gods, and essentially they were one and the same to the Sumerians, at least,
Right.
weren't they? They were, as the kings were doing things and being powerful. That's what the gods must have been doing, you know.
And we see myth as an extension of culture. It informs of us of what that culture valued, what that culture feared. You know, what were the virtues and vices, the strengths and merits and downfalls of that respective culture.
Absolutely, totally agree. And so with the four winds, this tempest being created, the kind of aftershock, if you like, of that creation, seems to send a shockwave to Tiamat, and it troubles her day and night. She tossed about. The god had no rest. They were burdened by each wind. So now we're starting to see the gods, the gods within Tiamat's belly, essentially tell Tiamat themselves, or like, you know, they're kind of getting in her head the same way Momu was doing to Apsu earlier on. When they killed your lover Apsu, you did not rally to his side, but sat in silence. Now he has created the four winds of dread. Your belly is troubled. We cannot sleep. So essentially, you know, your lover's died. You didn't do anything. Like, you need to, like, now he's moving into your territory. We can't sleep. Do something about it, essentially. We're seeing this kind of Tiamat, I don't know, almost seems like a little bit timid at the beginning. Like, didn't really, you know, the gods were clamoring at the beginning, and she wasn't really going to say anything until, and the thought of getting rid of them, because what Apsu
She's
said.
like the overly indulgent mother here.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's that maternal instinct. But then with, you know, with trauma and turmoil, she switches.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. I think it's great. So that's where we are. She's essentially the switch has been flipped. Essentially, we see the gods say, "Behold our burden. Our eyes have shriveled up. Break this relentless yoke, so that we may sleep. Make war and avenge them. Consign all that they have planned to oblivion." So, all out war here. This is flicking a switch. And Tiamat listened. That's exactly what it says. She found their speech good. So she's down. She's down. She's down to raise hell.
Down to kill her kids.
Yeah, like, why not? Um, this is where we start to see, this is probably more your forte, we start to see her creation of essentially what sounds like demonic entities, like evil creatures, right?
Yeah, so at this point she's no longer the mother of the gods. She is the mother of monsters. Like she's the original Lady Gaga mother monster herself. So she has 11 monsters that she gives birth to become the opponents of Marduk. What's interesting though is these specific monsters or chimeric beings, they are not solely the they're not solely plot points or figures within one myth alone. These are actually figures that predate the Enuma Elish. They are they're identified as threshold guardians. They're liminal beings who serve as messengers of the gods. So we have the Ugalu, who is the big weather beast, who's depicted as a leonine figure with bird's feet and a man's body. There's all sorts of creatures that are mentioned, and again, these are all predating the Enuma Elish and are the envoys, servants, and messengers of the gods.
So, like you said, we're seeing tropes, we're seeing characters that are being are reminiscent of earlier myths, right? Or even at the time myths rather, for the reader. But at this point, there is a god amongst her children, amongst her assembly, which she needs to elevate to Apsu's position as lover and right-hand man, general, however you want to say. And that person's name or god's name is Kingu.
She's elevating a general to the position of a consort king. Again, we have another act that is taken by a deity that would not be unknown to the readers or the listeners at that time. This, it was a common thing.
But we have the translation here. Literally, you are the greatest. You alone will be my lover. So he's taking the role, isn't it, as the husband, as the
This is my son and also my lover.
which, yeah, people did that too. May your word be the greatest among all the Anunnaki. And again, this is where we see an introduction of another myth, which would have been known. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies. So
the Tablet of Destinies that were possessed by Enlil in the myth concerning Ninurta and his fight against Anzu, which, interestingly enough, has very similar plot points to the Enuma Elish.
Correct, and exactly what we were going to come on to. And one of the tablets is that we see exactly the same kind of language or the same setup. But we see, interestingly enough, a title a sentence rather, that's attributed to Enki as well, on one of his tablets by Rimsin, the King Rimsin. May your pronouncements be unaltered, your utterance firm. So we see this on one of the famous foundation tablets to Rimsin, where it says about Enki, your command is kind of, your word is kind of unfaltered. I think that it's actually, I have a little replica of said tablet here. Well, I made it. It's not a replica, but what is it? Inimani uru, your word is powerful. That kind of stuff. Your word is powerful. Your word cannot be changed. We see that a lot. In the language, your utterance is firm. Or your word, basically what you say goes. It can't be changed, no matter what you say.
And it's also a cultural significance with regards to divine decrees that are issued by the king, that are then carried out as laws that then affect, the lives of everyday citizens.
Absolutely, and literally goes on to say that what you've just said. He fixed the fates of gods, of her gods, her sons. So now we start to see, moving on to tablet 2, Tiamat gathered those that she fashioned, braiding battle for the gods, her offspring. So essentially, she's going against the higher gods, right? She's taking the lower gods and going against the higher gods, the Anunnaki. Um, Ea, Yah, Enki heard these words, and he was struck dumb within his chamber and sat down in silence. Essentially, he goes to his father, Anshar, and tells him what's going on. You know, Tiamat's going to raise hell. She's got all these demons. She's got the gods. They're coming for us. Like, we need to do something about it. And this is where we see what you just said. We see the Ninurta and Anzu kind of trope. Someone's going to have to go and kill, you know, Tiamat, this god. So it literally said about Ea going to tackle Tiamat, right?
All right, which one of us is going to go kill mom?
Literally, when you say it like that, yeah, literally.
Hashtag matricide.
So we've got patricide and we've got matricide and incest, apparently, as you said earlier. So maybe we're touching on so many different things, and we're only on tablet 2.
Hashtag family values.
Essentially, Enki goes after Tiamat, doesn't he? And essentially tries to put her down. But her unfathomable roar, her fearsome roar, is enough to make him quake and turn away.
And at this point, she's given a new epithet. She's no longer referred to as Tiamat. She's referred to as Mother Noise, which speaks to that power that she now manifests.
It's quite hard to keep up with as well sometimes with the name changes, but it's part of Mesopotamian mythology, isn't it? We see people they're normally called by their epithets every other line, and then it'll go back to their original name. There's a bit of a skill to reading these, isn't there? There's a way that you have to read them, or else you get lost. Especially with compositions this deep in lore as well. So they make it a challenge. Thanks, Babylonians. Kingu is fixing fates and being pronounced as the highest among the Anunnaki, or the greatest among the Anunnaki. So now we're seeing Enki kind of lament to Anshar and saying, I killed Apsu. So now we see Enki go out to find Tiamat's scheme, but he stopped dumbstruck and turned back, came into the presence of lordly Anshar, making obeisance as he spoke to him. Tiamat's doings are beyond me. I found out her course, but my spell is no match for her. So here we are. We're starting to see Enki can't do it. So then who gets sent next? Anu. Anu can't do it. How about Marduk? You know? And that's essentially what happens. Enki essentially turns to Marduk and says, listen to the counsel of your father. You are my son. Draw near, go before Anshar. Let him see you and find calm. So essentially, go to Anshar and he'll tell you the same thing. Again, the repetition. You need to go and find out what Tiamat's doing. You know, be our savior, that kind of thing. Go, my son who knows all reason. Bring Tiamat to rest with your sacred spell. So now after basically we have the same for the whole tablet 3, we have a repetition of what we've already heard. We get to tablet 4, which is essentially now Marduk's being sent on this quest to kill Tiamat, and he's being venerated at the same time. You know, you are the most important among the great gods. Your fate is unrivaled. Your command is like Anu's, which literally translates to, in the Akkadian, your command is Anu, in reference to Anu's traditional status as moral authority among the gods, which is what you mentioned earlier. He's kind of taking over that position. You know, essentially, they're fixing the fates for him. Your fate, Lord, shall equal the gods. Command destruction or creation, and it shall be done. It sounds like he's been formally sworn in.
Yeah, he's being deputized to take on this role and to stand as the champion of the people, or in this case, the gods.
And he's being psyched up, right? So now, I think it would be wise to go on to the battle itself, because this is where we get the cosmology, right? This is where we get
this is where we get the cosmology that is found in numerous parts of the Near East. So we have of Yahweh or Adonai with Leviathan. We have in the Hellenic world, we have Apollo versus the Python, Baal versus Mot, and it just goes from there. Then in later antiquity, we have Thor and the Midgard serpent.
The next thing that we hear, or we see, we read, is the Lord spread out his net, trapping her. He unleashed in her face the evil wind that held the rear, which sounds a little bit like he farted in her face to me. But Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow it. So basically, he's killing everybody, right? He's defeated Tiamat. All the gods have scrambled. He declared triumph for Anshar over all his opponents. Blah, blah, blah. He split open her head with a merciless club. And essentially now, from her body, right, we get, I think it's the bottom half, we get the earth. And from the skin of her top, we get the sky, I think.
Yes, and then from her eyes come the waters of the Tigris Euphrates, and her breasts become mountains. So it's quite a grisly end to this matricidal battle, where Earth is essentially, she, the progenitor, the mother goddess, is subdued, and her corpse is used to start a new chapter in the story of creation.
I agree. And the imagery here that we get on this section is quite brutal, if you like. The Lord grew calm and examined her corpse to carve up the watery mass and create artful things. He split her in two like a dried fish, set her half of her up as the roof above heaven. This can be taken to mean that Tiamat's watery body was stretched out above the heavens, or that the heavens were made out of Tiamat's upper half as a roof over the world. Marduk is now he's positioning the gods into their astral forms. After he had planned out the year, he fixed Nibiru's station to mark the bonds between the stars.
Now let's pause here, because you've brought up a term that is often misunderstood. So let's break away into the segment of making a mess of Potamia.
The word in question, Nibiru.
Let's make a mess of Potamia and dissect this word that many people think is a planet outside of our known solar system that will eventually collide with Earth and bring about the end of humanity and the world and cosmos as we know it.
Nibiru is essentially a word that translates to crossing. So it's referring to Jupiter, essentially. And that was the astral form of Marduk. Right? And in Sumerian, the name is Nibiru. So it's obviously it's slightly different, but it's normally written with the key determinative in Sumerian, which tells us it's a place name specifically. And that's about as deep as it goes.
Well, it's certainly enough to digest. We've got the Enuma Elish, we've got matricide, we've got patricide, we have the gross desecration of corpses to create the known world, and we've unraveled the mess of Potamia that is Nibiru. What's going on with our next episode? Well, stay tuned. Dude, kudos to you. Thank you for taking the reins of this, because I don't know what my deal was today. Like, I feel absolutely